Hello, everyone. This is Luke Johnson from Noetic.online, the humanities social media app, and we are back with another episode with Dr. Jonathan Cook. I am very excited to be having this conversation today because we're going to be talking about a favorite subject of mine. We're going to be talking about H.G. Wells's The Time Machine, and philosophically, and from a literature perspective, I have to say that the entire work of H.G. Wells, and this book in particular, rings a lot of bells for me, Dr. Cook. So let's just jump right into it.
Yeah. Well, I'm a great Wellsian too. Certainly, he's a relatively neglected figure in academia today, but of course that means he's just overdue for a revival.
And I think that revival is coming. I really do. I really do, for a lot of different reasons. But he does have a very popular following outside of academia. There are many talks and courses online on YouTube that you can go. I consumed a number of them that I think a lot of people are finding new interest in him. So maybe we should talk first about the circumstances that led to the composition of The Time Machine. Yeah,
so this was Wells' big breakthrough book. You know, he'd been doing a lot of journalism in the early 1890s, and he was really struggling to survive as a writer because, you know, he got his degree in zoology from a sort of a London extension school, really learned a lot from his mentor, Thomas Henry Huxley, and then he had to figure out what to do for a living. So he did a bunch of sort of highbrow journalism, but he really couldn't support himself and his wife because he had married his cousin a few years earlier, but he had he just recently left his wife to pick up with a student of his whom he called Jane, you know, and they were living together in Kent, and he had to. It was really a necessity is the mother of invention, because he said, I got to write something that is going to sell, and he thought back to a book, actually a series of short stories he'd written for a student publication when he was actually in the university system. It was a college science journal that he actually founded. And he wrote a 3-part story in that publication called the Chronic Argonauts, and it was a very bizarre story about a time traveler with a very peculiar name, and really had very little content to compare with the Time Machine, which he wrote in 1894, but he took some of the ideas of time travel and a guy disappearing into the future forever, and so he produced this work in 1894 in I think only a few months really, and it became a very popular book with his publisher was Macmillan. And so it kind of catapulted him into the situation where he felt confident that he could write his other science fiction work. So he was very quickly writing the War of the Worlds and the Island of Dr. Moreau and the Invisible Man. All those well-known books from the mid-1890s came out pretty quickly, one after the other. And he realized he could make a living as a writer at that point.
So let me ask you this: Are you as excited about time travel as I am? Is that why you chose this book? Because you were the one who selected it. What made you choose this text to discuss?
Well, I've taught it on and off for a while, and currently I'm teaching it in a course of mine that I call Monsters and Nightmares. So this is the first book we read, and it's a good introduction to. It's not necessarily that I'm crazy about science fiction, but because I don't really read much of it, but I just want to want to read a major author, H.G. Wells, and read a book that was emerged from the debates over evolution in the later 19th century, and just investigate how these new ideas about species evolving and the enhanced understanding of the age of the Earth, how all of this led to H.G. Wells's act of imagination and creating this idea of time travel into the future, because I'm interested in the history of science and the Victorian science as well. I'm a great admirer of Huxley and Darwin as well, the whole Darwinian revolution. I'm fascinated by its impact on America and England at the same time in the later 19th century. So I don't know, just a good book to study evolution from a literary point of view, and to read one of these iconic books just like Dracula. Books that really enhance your cultural literacy, pretty much.
Definitely. I mean, there's so many. I think there've been a lot of. There's a lot of references to the time machine in other media, and I think it'll help you sort of unlock a lot of those secrets. But I think you're right to focus on its elaboration upon Darwinian theory, and that's probably where the real intellectual sustenance for this book comes from. Like for me, I was seeking out like a robust conception of what is time. What is the science of time travel? And we don't really get a lot from this book. I think the most interesting thing that we get is when the time traveler sort of reappears, his friends at the dinner party ask him where he's been. And I think he replies to something to the effect of, I was right here. Yeah. It's a question of when I was, right? So I think that's interesting I think that's interesting if you're trying to get your mind around what it means to traverse the space-time continuum. So I think it's interesting in that respect, but I think you're right. It helps us get our mind around what Darwinian theory is and what it could possibly lead to in certain dynamic situations, right? 800,000 years into the future, 3 million years into the future, and trying to understand the rivulets of species that happen if there are certain social conditions that are in place. And then there's probably a lot to be said for, political stuff, like what Wells is probably tapping into as far back as Plato's The Republic and the idea of the philosopher kings kind of managing everything. So, but I'll let you introduce a lot of those ideas. The question I had next was, you mentioned that Wells was looking to be a successful writer. Was time travel a gimmick to get his foot in the door and to get his next books underwritten?
Well, yeah. I mean, he'd already written about it, so he was a pioneer in thinking up this as a fictional idea. I mean, Jules Verne had done space travel and going to the center of the Earth, and so there were interesting precursors to Wells, but he really set the agenda for a lot of modern science fiction, I think. And time travel, it's interesting that 10 years after this book was published, Einstein set forth his general theory of relativity. And so the whole environment of the 1890s was a time of excitement and challenging of social norms and consciousness of the problems of English society, because there were, Wells came from a lower class environment. He basically was living in poverty for parts of his life. I mean, his mother ended up as a lady's maid. His father was tried to open a store selling sporting goods and then failed, and Wells was forced to go out and apprentice as in a draper shop and as a chemist. He really had to struggle to get an education. I mean, he was lucky in that he found positions to advance himself. He was someone who came to science. He didn't take it for granted because he really had worked hard to and become a teacher, and then he studied with this great Victorian Darwinian, Huxley. So I think, it was a combination of a sort of a dreamy young man who became very focused on science, and he studied zoology, so he studied, the evolution of life and different species. He wrote a biology textbook, just before he wrote The Time Machine, a couple of years before. So he was pumped up with scientific ideas, except he had the imagination of a writer, and so he liked to play around with these ideas that were sort of on the cutting edge of science, and sort of imagine his way into the future by just thinking about how things would change, evolve, doing thought experiments. Just like he wrote a book of The War in the Air. He predicted aerial warfare before it took place. He even anticipated the invention of the atomic bomb by his, I forget which book it was that set forth the idea of harnessing the power of the atom. But it's true,
It's like he had some inside information on this.
Yeah. Well,
he got it right.
Just his mind. I mean, just like Poe and Eureka. People read Poe's Eureka and they are amazed at some of his insights. Of course, it was just his imagination. There was no scientific proof that he was presenting. But the thing that strikes me about the Time Machine is, he gets by on so little. His Time Machine, he never describes how it works. It just has a little bit of ivory, and it's got a little lever, and it's got a lever. A lever, put it up and down,
That's how it works. That's how
time travel works. And because Wells was an avid bicycle rider, he has it as the seat is like a saddle, like he's getting in a bicycle, and he does the lever. And there's nothing, describing what it looks like, so of course it's really just sort of like a, fairy tale, and
that's how all science kind of starts out, right? It seems comes from a lot of fairy tales and mythological ideas, and then we have to substantiate it. So, like you mentioned Einstein earlier, he did the famous thought experiment of traveling on a light beam, right?
Exactly.
To get to his conclusions. But it doesn't really matter where our imaginations goes, so long as the evidence supports it.
Yeah, I mean, that's how science works. You get the hypotheses, and then you try to ground it in testable, repeatable experiments. So,
well, why don't you help us understand what the narrative structure of the novel is?
Yeah, so, it's basically what's called a frame story. So he has an outside narrator who's never named. People think it might be the character at the end who sort of walks by as the time travel is returning. But he has no formal name. And he's one of a group of professional men who are there on a Thursday night who meet regularly to discuss contemporary issues. And, the time traveler is living in Richmond, which is an affluent suburb outside of London. It's southwest of the city, up the Thames. And so the story is introduced by the frame narrator, and then, of course, the time traveler talks about the theory of the fourth dimension, and then he disappears, and he says he's arranged for everyone to come back the following Thursday to meet him there, and the whole story is pretty much the story of the time traveler narrates his story. So when you're reading it, you see quotation marks at the beginning of every paragraph because he's narrating the story within the story, just like just like Heart of Darkness, and Marlowe. Starts out sitting in a boat on the Thames, and his whole experience going up the river in the Congo is told as a narrative within a narrative. So, at the end of the story, of course, the time traveler ends his story, and we pick up with the frame narrator talking about, whether it's true or not, and that people are expressing their doubts, and the time traveler's kind of being coy about whether it really happened. And then, of course, he's already shown them the flowers that he's brought back from the future, and one of the guys who was there with him looks at it and they says, well, it doesn't seem to resemble any plant that he knows of, right? So there's a little hint like, yeah, this is a future flower, this is a sign of the future. And then, of course, the time traveler says, well, I'm going to make another trip, and he, goes right back to his machine because he wants to, his appetite has been whetted for some other period of history to explore, and the outside narrator says he's been going for 3 years now, so he's just putting this story together, as a completed narrative at this point. What struck me though in this reading is the little ending where the time traveler, the narrator says that the flower that the time traveler's brought back from the future is a sign that humane values still exist at that time. So it's a little sentimental reminder that the human instinct for altruism has not been totally obliterated by no matter what's happened in the future world. So
that raises a lot of interesting questions about what it means to be human.
Yeah.
Right. Because I'm not convinced that we are dealing with humans.
Yeah.
When he travels so far into the future, we have these two. We have these two groups. We have the Eloi. Am I saying it correctly?
Eloi. Yeah. Eloi.
Eloi. I've never said it aloud. And then the Morlocks.
Yeah.
And what's interesting about this is, I have I had some preperceptions about Wells based on some of his other work that I had consumed. And what I noticed is who you think the Morlocks and the Eloi are is kind of a Rorschach test. It's kind of one of those Wittgenstein duck rabbits where you see what you want to see. And we were having a conversation earlier about realities that we imprison ourselves in. I had mapped my own conceptual framework onto who the Morlocks were and who the Eloi were. And then I went and I listened to all these lectures on it. Apparently every other learned man thinks the exact opposite as I do.
Huh.
I thought, I'm trying to, so I don't get this mixed up. Like I kind of had the conception that the Morlocks were this intellectual, technocratic ruling class that had turned everybody else into chattel or to cattle.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of scholars see it the exact opposite way, that the intellectual ruling class was the Eloi, and then they became so effete and complacent that the underlings took them over in some way.
Well, it's a little bit difficult. I mean, the Morlocks are definitely, a grotesque looking ape-like creature who prey on the Eloi and use them for food, right? And they also seem to provide all their necessities because, they wear these kind of toga-like garments and they have these sandals, and I guess they get their fruit themselves, but they need a minimal upkeep, and it seems like the Morlocks are doing that. And there's a hint that they have some kind of factory mechanism underground. At least they have a ventilation system that brings the air down there. So Wells leaves it very obscure what kind of manufacturing ability the Morlocks have, but they're clearly the predatory class. I wouldn't say they give any sign of superior intelligence because they, they have a basic fear of fire. They have this terror of fire. So they're like a caveman, who in terms of their mentality. And I think they just have a kind of cunning in their leftover instincts to do the work that needs to be done, and then somehow they have, because the Earth doesn't seem to have any mammals left. I mean, there's no sign of other mammalian life except for the Eloi. They rely on them for food, but it's clear that neither class has any kind of intellectual integrity or ability, because the description.
I would say from our perspective, both classes are degenerates, but they both have degenerated in different ways.
Yeah.
The Eloi have surrendered all, have kind of embraced sort of a childlike mindlessness.
Yeah.
And the Morlocks have embraced nefarious cannibalism.
Yeah. Yeah. They've taken advantage of the Eloi's fecklessness, right? Because they, they don't really do anything, haven't really been able to defend themselves. The Eloi just, basically, they cling together like a herd. That's the only way. So it's like a herd of wildebeest, hiding from a lion. But there's nothing particularly outwardly or violently predatory about the Morlocks. I mean, the funny thing is, when the narrator describes being attacked by them, he says that they kind of touch him with these kind of wimpy paws. I mean, they're not grabbing him, they're not stabbing him with weapons. They're sort of, it's almost like they're sort of weak creatures who can't do anything without being in a gang, and they don't seem to even have that much physical strength, because it's more the sense of being touched by them that arouses his horror than actually having them, snarling in his face or anything. They're not very well described. They're more like, they have big eyes, they have pale skin. They're kind of pale ape-like creatures who move around quickly. I guess they have a sort of chimp-like agility, because they're described as moving around like spiders. So, I guess maybe they do have the strength, but certainly when they attack him, they are not exerting, their full strength to pull him into their well when he goes underground there, or when he's trying to get away from them. In the final scene where he's beating him with his lever, trying to get into his time machine to get out of there. So, anyway, my thoughts on who they symbolize could be affected by. I actually watched one of the Time Machine movies. Yeah,
I watched
which
the
one?
1960 version.
Oh yeah, that's a wonderful one. I really love that.
I didn't know. Yeah. So I mean, it's very easy to, the Morlocks in the 1960 version are like these like blue gorillas, right?
Yeah. Yeah, they're primitive.
The Eloi are like these
like a hippie beatniks.
Yeah, they're like beatnik flower children.
Yeah, right.
And and then there's the love interest, right? What's her
Weena, yeah.
Weena, yeah, she's quite lovely.
Yeah, well, we don't get much of a description for her, except she seems to be more like a child than an adult female, and she. Well,
yeah. I mean, they're all childlike.
Yeah.
But, I mean, she's a beautiful woman in the movie.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. Oh, so maybe that's coloring how I see these groups and who they symbolize. So, but I've sort of laid out how traditional scholars understand who these types of people, these two types of groups are. What do you think? What's your view?
Well, I mean, I just rely on the time travelers theorizing, which is that each group evolved from a different social class in Victorian England, because Wells was a very astute social critic. I mean, a lot of his novels are exploring the class-ridden society of late Victorian England. I mean, he had a very kind of ambivalent position because, he was part of sort of the lower class, working class, but on the other hand, he had educated himself out of it into the middle class, and he kind of had a fear of the brutishness of the mob and the mass of people and the lower class unemployed people in England. But I mean, I think Eloy are clearly the kind of degenerate upper class people that you could easily find in England in the 1890s. At the time, there was just vast inequalities of wealth. I mean, you had just an amazing concentration of wealth into the upper class, the aristocracy and the industrialists who were represented the new money. I mean, people who are you find in the world of Oscar Wilde, some of those upper class people, his boyfriend, the son of the Marquis of Queensberry, and these kind of effete aristocrats were very prominent in the fin de siècle, and I think Wells just felt all he had to do was sort of look at each group developing the way he studied, zoology and got his degree in zoology as a separate species. The privileged people have all the money and the power, but on the other hand, the less involved they are with making a living, the more they evolve to not have any use for parts of their brain that make them more motivated or taking initiative or thinking out problems. There's no challenge to their life, whereas the lower classes are forced to make a living, and they are they're relegated to the underground, which is a very odd idea. But on the other hand, you think of the Victorian class system where all the servants are below stairs. A lot of people are working in mines and factories, so they're kind of working in these enclosed spaces. So the idea of being, eventually migrating underground, I guess, makes sense. It's hard to imagine a whole civilization developing like this with all these working class people forced underground. Because I don't know what the advantages would be for living underground at this point, except I guess that they're adapted to living in the dark. They have the vision and it's just a question of habit, I guess, at this point.
Or being underground's a really good place to hide your cannibalism.
Yeah, I guess that's an idea. There's something shameful about it, so they occupy a lower moral space, so that naturally they belong underground. I guess there's also the idea of the caveman, because I think there was a fair amount of knowledge about primitive man at this point. Neanderthal bones had been discovered in the 1850s. And I think they were excavating caves, and knew that primitive man lived in caves. So maybe that ties in with it as well.
Well, what do you think? Just for a second longer, what about this idea that Wells was trying to make, or was inspired by Plato's Republic? Do you see that here? And if he was, is this a critique of it?
Yeah. Well, what Plato sees, the philosopher kings, and then
I think there's a stratification. I forget,
yeah. I mean, you have the fighters and working people. So yeah, it's stratified, but I mean, you don't have any mastermind here. There's no philosopher king. It's it's a utopian society only in the beginning when it looks like everyone is having a nice time, for the Eloi. So, I mean, I think Wells was fascinated by the idea of utopia, but he gives us all kinds of varieties of utopia and dystopia as well, because dystopias are integral to social criticism. It's News from Nowhere of William Morris and Erewhon of Samuel Butler. These are contemporary books that use the idea of utopia or dystopia to critique Victorian England. It's an old tradition starting from Sir Thomas More. So this, this is a world that seems utopian at first, but then it's because the time traveler is ignorant about how things really work in what he sees. And there's no plan to this society. It's an evolved society. It's not carefully thought out and structured, in any kind of humane way. It's just what happens over time.
What you really could say, if it was a critique of Plato, what you could say is that you can have the best philosophical ideas about how a state ought to be organized, but then the biology is going to supersede your best laid plans.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
You can have this great idea to have guardians and auxiliaries and producers and all whatever, right? But then if that leads to Darwinian reverberations that ultimately make that constitution unsustainable, what does that say about all political philosophy to begin with? I guess that it constantly has to be reevaluated, that there can never really be a guidebook for how a republic ought to be constituted. I think that might be one of the biggest critiques that we could get from this. But what were some of the time traveler's theories about the world that he found himself in? 800,000 years?
802,701. And I'll tell you, there's a reason he came up with that number, which we can talk about a little bit later. But
I love numerology these days, so I want to hear all about it.
Well, I think there are basically three stages of his theorizing about the world that he finds. In the beginning, it seems like the Eloi, and he only knows about the Eloi without knowing about the Morlocks. It's a utopian world that seems very pleasant, but sort of boring, and doesn't really fulfill the time traveler's ideas about human improvement, because they're really not that smart. They're very passive, and when he lands there with his time machine, they ask him if he came in a hailstorm from the sun. They think he's kind of a god who has appeared out of nowhere, and they're and when his little friend Weena is drowning in the river, they're not doing anything about it. They're letting her cry out, so he has to go and rescue her. So they've lost a lot of the most important human, instincts and intellectual inquiry is absent in that world. So it's a very disappointing kind of utopian world for the time traveler. Then when he discovers the Morlocks, running around, and he thinks, well, these must be the servant class who have to hide themselves, and that, just like in his own Victorian world, you have the wealthy people, and then you have the people who take care of their needs and don't really live that well because they're not given as much money or, privileges or whatever. So, and then of course the Morlocks turn out to be the social class that maintains the Eloi as a source of food. So we see kind of the utopian idea reversing itself, and then Wells saying, well, this is what happens when humans allow systematic oppression to go on over time too long, so that the Victorian working class are shown to be seeking some kind of revenge on their masters by cannibalizing on them. So it seems to be a just revenge for the indignities and oppressions that the lower class people have put up with over time. So, over hundreds of thousands of years, this is the way things have evolved. I mean, I think, frankly, from what we know about evolution today, this could happen in a few thousand years, not hundreds of thousands of years, because modern humans, we're only about 100 or 150,000 years old, and so it doesn't take that much time to evolve into slightly different humanoid creatures,
Which would you rather be, Eloi or Morlock?
Well, the time travel identifies with the Eloi because they look more human. They have, the curly hair, even though they don't have facial hair. They dress in, they look like ancient Romans, I guess, because they have these sort of togas and sandals. So they relate more to the world he knows, even though they have little pointy chins and they're small and, don't behave the same way as humans.
I wonder if anyone's ever taken liberties with this book and tried to write it from the perspective of the Morlocks.
Of the Morlocks, yeah. That would be interesting.
That would be interesting. I think you've talked a good bit already about the social structure and how it related to Wells's own day. So maybe we should talk a little bit more about the far future that the time traveler went into. I think this would be interesting to elaborate upon.
Well, people who think of the time machine, they think of the Eli Morlocks, but then they forget that he makes two other visits into the future. So, he barely escapes from being pursued by Morlocks. I mean, it's kind of an adventure movie ending as he gets back into his time travel machine. But then he goes into a sort of indefinite future. It doesn't really say exactly, but at that point there are no human creatures, and what he sees are these big crab-like creatures with sort of tentacles, and one of them is reaching out to him to touch him as he gets back into his time machine. So he sees a very a reduced population of species on the Earth. He sees a butterfly as this final kind of sign of beauty or some connection with his own world.
Aren't the butterflies like kind of massive and have?
Yeah, the big butterflies.
Yeah.
So it's clearly not a very inviting world, and I think what we're seeing is sort of the idea of the entropy that was already theorized about what's going to happen to the Earth and the universe. Of course, the theory was that the energy of the sun would be burning out over anywhere from 20 to 50 million years, so that the Earth would become cooler because the sun was losing its heat, and maybe eventually the planets would fall into the sun. So the time traveler is investigates that world. Then he goes into the future of 30 million years in the future, and all he sees is this kind of black creature the size of a football, kind of in the edge of the water, and he can't even identify it as resembling anything. And the seas are almost dead, and the Earth seems to be on the brink of extinction at that point. So this is interesting because it ties in, 30 million years, it ties in with the idea of Lord Kelvin that the sun was going to burn out within 20 to 50 million years, or they had a vague idea because they had no idea that the sun burnt through, using atomic energy. They thought the heat of the sun came like from a fire, like a coal fire. So of course that's going to burn out, eventually. You can't have millions and millions of years with this big great mass burning like a fire. I think Wells was exploring the idea that this might be the ultimate limit of the Earth, the age of the Earth, 30 million years. And, the time traveler spends even less time there. He basically takes a look and then gets back in his machine and returns to the present. So he's kind of testing the outer limits of time travel to sort of go to the very edge of life on Earth and see what it looks like, and then kind of go back to the present. And then sit down and tell his story to everyone.
Yeah. So, there were a lot of the subjects that I look into. There's a lot of science fiction, science fantasy going on at this time. Did you ever encounter a writer named Ingersoll?
Well, what period is he writing in?
About the same time. He wrote. It's not really incredibly relevant to this conversation, but he wrote a book in like 1895 called "The Marvelous Underground Adventures of Baron Trump." Have you ever heard of this?
Yeah, I think I have. Well, I don't know. Is that Robert Ingersoll, the famous atheist? I think it's a different Ingersoll. Because there was, Robert Ingersoll was a friend of Mark Twain. He was a popularizer of Darwinian ideas and a notorious agnostic in the later 19th century, who came from the Midwest, actually.
Actually, this was Ingersoll Lockwood.
Ingersoll Lockwood, yeah. So was he American or English?
I believe he was an American, but he wrote a series of novels. They're called Baron Trump's Marvelous Underground Adventures, something about his dog Bulcher, and then the last of the series was called The Last President. Have you heard about this?
No, I don't know this at all.
Oh. Yeah, it's pretty interesting. But he was writing about the same time.
Well, is it science fiction or fantasy fiction or sort of a both?
It's kind of a little both.
Yeah,
it's interesting. In Baron Trump's Marvelous Underground Adventures, he has a mentor named the Dawn of All Dawns, and they go through the Ural Mountains of Russia, an underground cavern system. It's very interesting, but. Why did this one, this is something that's kind of contemporaneous. Why did the time machine, why did it get elevated to classic status? Classic sci-fi status.
Yeah. Wells had a good publisher, Macmillan, and I think, it was the mid-1890s. There was a sense of hunger for new ideas. The fin de siècle was a time of big, intellectual turmoil in England, and particularly the mid-90s. It was kind of a turning point where people were open to new ideas, because after the Oscar Wilde trial in 1895, that sort of shocked the public back into embracing, more conventional values and ideas, and becoming more defensive about England's role in the world. But in the beginning of the 1890s, there was a time of kind of cultural experiment and a lot of interesting new fiction and artwork, Audrey Beardsley, was doing his illustrations for the Yellow Book. So I just think there was an appetite for new ideas that Wells was able to take advantage of. Then they had the picture of Dorian Gray from the early 1890s, Oscar Wilde's book. I mean, that's kind of a science fiction story of a man whose picture reflects his real moral condition, and he stays perpetually young. It's a parable about moral responsibility and growth. So I think that's about the best response I can give on that one.
Well, I think it's a great response. I mean, yeah, it's a very difficult question to answer. Succinctly.
I forget exactly how many actual books were sold over a certain amount of time. I mean, he's not selling millions of copies. He's selling enough to get attention at the time, tens of thousands, I guess.
I think he was I think his dance card was pretty full after the Time Machine.
Yeah. Well, he just cranked out, one work after. I mean, he was enormously prolific, and that was the beginning of a career that spanned 50 years basically of writing.
I'm so fascinated by this relationship that he had with Thomas Huxley.
Yeah.
And then how and what that meant for his career.
Yeah.
And then how much that relationship goes on to affect what Aldous Huxley and Eric Blair and all these other people who are writing these. I mean, the fact that all these people kind of knew each other, we're all kind of hanging out.
Yeah.
That's kind of amazing.
Well, Wells, in fact, the idea of the White Sphinx, the kind of enigmatic creature that's there that, he has this machine next to. I read an interesting article that said that he likely got it from an article of Huxley talking about the condition of England and the relationship between social classes. That was, Huxley said that's it's the riddle of the Sphinx. What's going to happen to this very volatile class world that they have in England with so many unemployed. I mean, you had hundreds of thousands of people tramping the streets in London in the 1890s. And Jack London wrote a really great book about that experience by disguising himself as a tramp, going around with them. Huxley, I think, helped, gave him that idea of the Sphinx as the emblematic creature for the time traveler's first glimpse of the future. But the other thing was that Wells, he was well connected because he lived in Kent, and he became friends with Stephen Crane. He was good friends with Conrad, Joseph Conrad. He knew Henry James, and Henry James admired his work. Eventually, he wrote a very funny parody of James called Boone, which is about a 100-page story about with a very, very little. I mean, it's a parody of later James and all the belabored prose about the most elementary things happening in his narrative. So Wells was really at the center of an amazing group of writers at the end of the century, and all of them, read each other's work and learned from each other. Of course, Stephen Crane died in the late 90s, but Conrad and James lived on, and they kept reading each other's work. I think Conrad and Wells stayed friends for a while. I think James kind of lost interest in Wells. There's a good book about that group of writers, I read it a while ago, so I can't remember.
I'll look into it.
Yeah.
And I think this white sphinx the enigmatic white sphinx is something that really might be a good place to leave things off. But
yeah,
my inclination is trying to answer the riddle of the sphinx. When I recognize any sort of Egyptian symbology anywhere, I guess that's when I know it's time to make an exodus.
Yeah.
Well, that's when I know it's time to come out of it.
Well, it's interesting because the Sphinx is, what's the riddle of the Sphinx? What walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs in the afternoon, 3 legs in the evening? Of course, man. So the idea is that what has man become in the world of 800, 2701? And the other thing is that the Sphinx, of course, is a composite creature. Human chimera, yeah, which is kind of what the future creatures of the world are. The Morlocks are kind of ape-like, and the Eloi they almost look like little kittens. So it just sort of raises the idea of what does it mean to be human, and raises makes the point that human beings are products of evolution from other animals. So our humanity is only a temporary stage of the development of nature. So
I think you were going to reveal the secret of the year.
Oh, the year, yeah. Well, 802,701, I think what I read is it's sort of designed to illustrate the idea of entropy. The first number and the second number, each of the 3 numbers sort of being one above the other. So the idea of the world sort of winding down slowly but surely. Because Wells was, he knew this theory, and I think he's sort of integrating that into the number, because it's hard to represent anything. It's not an arbitrary number because it seems so sort of formulaic. So I think the idea is that it's showing things winding down for the future.
Yeah, I've noticed that numbers are very, very important in time travel movies, especially the number 8 or the numbers 88. Like Back to the Future, the DeLorean has to go 88.
Yeah,
Donnie Darko has a long number. I used to have it memorized, but he has it. Have you seen Donnie Darko?
No, that's a movie.
It's amazing. Yeah. It's totally amazing. It's very amazing on a lot of levels. I'm just looking at these numbers. I'm wondering what the sum of them is. It's 18. If you can sum it up, you get to the number 9, which is significant in a lot of numerological circles.
Yeah.
But that's for another day.
Yeah.
Well, I thoroughly enjoyed having this conversation, and I love thinking about time travel. I will probably write a book one day that involves something involving time. So
yeah,
I see this as great preparation and research for that. But I think we should probably bring it to a close there, and maybe talk for a second about what we want to cover next.
Yeah. Well, should we close off? Okay.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. Cook. I really appreciated it.
Okay.
All right. Bye-bye.